Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our course breakdown for this week's Tour Championship in the newly renovated Eastlake Golf Club. I'm going to have some boots on the ground action for you guys on Wednesday through Sunday. Going to be there for the Content Creator Classic out there Wednesday, also some of the Pro-Am and practice rounds going on, and then for the entire golf tournament. So stoked for it. It'll be my fourth straight year heading up to Atlanta for this event. So one that I always try and make, and this year with the newly renovated golf course, gonna have a lot to talk about from that end. So here in this video, gonna cover all the details here for 2024, including what we already know about some of the course changes. Of course, as the week goes on, I'll probably have even more for you guys out there on the live streams and other pieces of content that we're doing. But gonna go over some of the changes that we have on paper and what we can expect from this iteration of the golf course. So whether you're out there playing some DFS lineups, going out there playing props, outright bets, whatever the case may be, we'll go over all of the information for you to make sure we're all on the same page. So we're going to start it off with some course details, then we'll go hole by hole. I'll talk about some of the changes that I've heard around Eastlake already, and then towards the end, we'll go through some of my stat modeling here on a Monday to give you an idea of what I'm looking for in specific players. But as I said, a lot to talk about here, so let's go ahead and hop right on in. Quite literally every single blade of grass around Eastlake is going to be different here in 2024, whether it's the fairways, the rough, a lot of trees that were taken off property. The course is now a par 71 as opposed to a par 70. There are a lot of things to talk about here. So let's go ahead, just start it off with some of the course major details, including that change in terms of par. So it was a par 70 in the past. They took hole number 14, changed it from a long par 4 into a scoreable par 5, but that is far from the only change that they've made. So scorecard yardage also a little bit longer to account for that par 5, but also a few other holes where you're going to see some added length. One of those being hole number 1, hole number 9 has a tee box that is a lot longer now this year, and a few other holes where you've seen a little bit of an angle change off the tee. We'll talk about those when we go hole by hole, but the course distance is a little bit beefier this year, which you'd expect when they're going to add a par out there, right? Make it a par 71, but a few other holes that haven't changed par, they're going to play a lot differently here this year. The green size has actually gone a little bit larger compared to what we had in 2023. The greens have a lot more playable space here in 2024, and that was one of the goals of Andrew Green in his restoration, was to bring back some of the old Donald Ross style, effect at this golf course. And you're going to see that with hole 16. There's a chipping hollow that wasn't there before. That was part of the original Donald Ross design. And I think it's going to make for a lot more playable pin locations out here this year. I think that, in the past, they'd had to go back to their same 2 or 3 out there per green, but because they're larger, because some of the sides have been softened a little bit, I think you're going to see a lot more variation in terms of setup. Your fairways are a little bit larger, but it's worth noting that with the change to a new type of zoysia grass, that they're getting a lot more rollout on this version of the golf course, and especially in 2024, as the grass is just trying to get settled in at this point, it's going to be a lot firmer this year. So they've got the different zoysia, you've got the firmer fairways going on. So though they are slightly larger from the 24 acres of fairway that they had last year, I think that they're going to play the same size, if not smaller, because of those minute changes. The rough is also a little bit less substantial. It's not so much that the fairways are so much larger that is taking away from the rough, but they've added in a lot of natural areas. So in between the holes, it's a lot less of the Augusta National, heck, even what we saw out there in Colorado sort of feel. It's much more rugged and natural terrain that you're going to have around this kind of golf course now. The water hazards are in play in 8 holes as opposed to 6 holes from the year prior. You've still got that iconic par 3 that's over water, but a few other holes where now you're actually going to have water as a factor. The greens are now a different strain of Bermuda grass. They've gone from, I believe it was a Champion Bermuda, but now it's a Tiff Eagle Bermuda out there. Let's see. So it was actually a Mini Verity Bermuda before, but yeah, now it's that Tiff Eagle. Not going to make a huge difference when you're looking at putting stats or whatnot, but at least worth pointing out different type of zoysia grass that you have on the approaches and fairways. And then the rough is also this Tiff Way Bermuda grass, which is only about 2.5 inches long, so maybe not as burly or as lush as what we've had in prior years, but a lot of that because the course quite literally opened a week ago. And if you haven't heard about it, there has been no play at this golf course since I believe it was August 18th at the earliest that they had people out there. And even then, it was only played for like 2 or 3 days. So I believe last weekend they had the first people out there, some architecture nerds. They had a lot of members out there playing this golf course, and then they shut it down on Sunday afternoon. So those are going to be the only people that really know what to expect from this golf course. And a lot of my notes out there from the changes this year, especially when we go hole by hole, are from people that actually played the golf course. So I read a few articles from a few architecture people that played those holes and actually went hole by hole, kind of breaking down the changes. And then I've also had a few email exchanges with members that have been, willing enough to give me some information as well. So we'll talk about some of that when we go hole by hole, and I'll tell you how it's going to play a little bit differently this year. In terms of the stat averages, we'll look at the last 3 years, but it's going to be a lot different this year. Birdie average is going to go significantly up with the addition of a par 5, and the bogey average might stay about the same, I would say, maybe go down a little bit because that long par 4 14th was really difficult when it was back there at the par 70, but these averages could look wildly different. The green regulation percentage, for example, right, is going to go down drastically with the super firm greens this year. So though you do have an easier setup with the par 71, because the turf isn't going to be completely broken in yet, this golf course could play extremely difficult this year. You saw it at the Wells Fargo after they went out there and changed out those greens. Quail Hollow played like a much different beast when it was super firm and fast, and I think it could be a lot of the same out here at East Lake. So I think the changes do help scoring. They're trying to set it up for a more exciting finish over the last 4 or 5 holes. That's part of the reason that they made 14 a par 5. It's also part of the reason that 17 now could be potentially drivable if they move up the tee box there. All of those changes, though, might not show the first time that we play it. It might play a little bit harder than what we're used to seeing, a lot because of the turf, again, not being completely broken in. But I think in the future, you're going to see lower scores around East Lake. That would make sense with it being a par 71, but the averages are going to be really hard to hone in on this year. There's going to be a lot of changes. Fairway average, for example, where you've got larger fairways now, but now they're going to run out a little bit more than we've seen in the past. It's hard to give you an idea with any sort of certainty how this golf course is going to play. So we'll at least look at them. You can see normally it's pretty hard to hit fairways. We'll have to see if that holds up with the slightly wider fairways this year. Green regulation average is probably going to go down at least 5-6%, maybe even worse than that. Scrambling rate is something that I want to keep a look at. It's normally not that difficult around at East Lake, but as you'll see with the hole 16, or I'll mention the chipping hollow that they added, I think that it's going to be a little bit harder this year to get up and down, especially with some firm and fast greens. So we'll have to see if that holds up. But yeah, we can go through all we want, right? We can look at the Bomber's Paradise versus, Bomber's Opportunity over here. It's not going to give us that much information, right? It's going to be so much different this year that I don't know how much we're going to bog ourselves down into the stats. So just go ahead, go hole by hole. I'll give you guys some of the information that I've been doing on the deep dive the last few days, and to hopefully bring you guys the goods out here for 2024. These overhead views were taken during the renovation, so they're going to be pretty horrible, but they're at least going to give us a chance to walk through the golf course together. So the first main change that you're going to have at hole number 1 is it's about 50 yards longer than what it was in the past, and this was already a brutal hole to begin with, so yeah, they're going to tip it out when it comes to the tee box, but the green complex is also a little bit further back than it was before. So this hole is going to play significantly harder than it has over the last few years, especially with some firm greens. I think it's going to be really hard to hold this green complex into out there with a mid to long iron, and it's just the first example of them trying to modernize this golf course, right? Adding a 500-yard par 4 to any course is pretty much commonplace per today's standards, but before this change, there weren't very many of those around at East Lake Golf Club. So you can see over here it says 467, but at least if they tip it out, it'll play closer to 510 yards, which is quite a difference when it comes to that scorecard yardage. Hole number 2, it says 196 yards, but it can play about 215 with its new iteration. And what I've heard about this green is that it's much larger than what you had before, but that the green complex is a lot more complicated. So I think hole number 2, based on what I've heard from some of the members that played it, is that it's going to come down to pin location, that there are distinct tiers out there to hole number 2, and that the bunkering that they've added around this hole, which is completely different than what it was before, is also really tricky. So of course, right, those guys have only played the hole once, and the ones that were trying to relay some of this information, but from all accounts, it feels like hole number 2 is going to have a lot more variety than it had before, but but it's pretty much the same hole. It's like 210, 215 yards, just like it was before if they go out there and tip it out. Hole 3 is where we're going to start to see quite a few changes. So it says 395 on paper here. It's closer to like 420, 430 yards this time around. And they've changed up the angle a little bit. So what you're going to see down here is rather than a straightforward par 4, like it looks on paper here, is that it is slightly angled. That off the tee, it's not going to be a straight shot. You're going to have to try and shot shape it a little bit to go out there and hold the short stuff. And the same thing into the green. So this is the main change on the front nine that you're going to hear me talk about over the next few holes here, is that rather than having each hole going up and straight down this massive hill that you have at East Lake, by the way, if you haven't been to the property here, where you're standing would be one of the high points on property, and then everything slopes down to the water that you see in the distance. So hole number 3 here plays directly downhill, or at least in the past, played directly downhill. Now it's going to have a little bit more of a lateral motion to it, right? I believe this hole goes a little bit from right to left, if memory serves me correctly. Might be left to right. I'm not 100% sure on that one with hole number 2, but what I do know is that it's no longer just a straight downhill hole where it's about an execution test, right? Going out there, just hitting the ball straight off the tee, then hitting it straight into the green. They've added a little bit more complexity here in this version. Hole 4 is the same thing. So the way that it contours down hole number 3 does the exact opposite off hole number 4. So while in the past, this had been a pretty straightforward par 4, I believe it goes from right to left, by the way. So I think that the one over there, hole 3, goes a little bit to the right off the tee, then back to the green this way. This does the exact opposite, right? You're hitting out a little bit to the right off the tee here, and then back up to the left over there with your green. And it's just going to make it a little bit harder to hit the fairways, I would say. You have to have a specific shot shape to go out there and hold them, especially when they're firm and fast. And it's about 480. I think it might even play a little bit longer here this year, but definitely going to be a tricky test. Hole 5 is 442, so this one is back down the hill. Also, they've added a little bit of lateral movement over there, and we'll talk about it when we get to hole 7 in particular, but these trees over here to the left are a lot less dense than what they were before. They took a lot of those out. Hole number 6 is 520. This is a par 5 up the hill. They changed up the tee shot here quite a bit, also making it a little bit harder to hit the short stuff, but it's about the same length. It's pretty much the same hole. Again, different green. It's going to look a little different when you're out there putting in, with your around the green shots, but it's about the same length. It's still a par 5, so nothing has changed on that end. Hole 7 is going to have a completely different look. In fact, you can see it from the overhead view here. In the past, this second shot where the landing area is had an infinite amount of trees to the right. I mean, it was one of the densest portions of the entire property. In fact, it was like a shoot effect off the tee to try and hit this fairway, which now you can see it's just all dirt out there from these overhead views. But they took all of those trees out, which is going to open up the property in terms of its views, but also going to make it a little bit less of a difficult tee shot. So obviously we can't see the rough, we can't see the bunkering from these overhead views as they were taken when the golf course was being dug up, but they've made the angles off the tee at this golf course a little bit harder, and you're going to see that with hole number 7. Hole 8, a big change. So hole 8 is actually 60 yards shorter than what they had before. So I know we mentioned about them adding some length at like holes number 1. You can see it on 14, the par 5 now. They changed from a par 4. But your tee box is way up here now. So the hole's actually going to play, I set the wrong one, sorry. It's supposed to be tee position that we're setting up there. Target number 1 will still set somewhere out there in the fairway. It's actually going to play a little bit longer than 320. So let's set the tee box a little bit further back. But it's going to play about 350 yards, which is about yonder if we're going to set the tee box. And what they're going to do, at least based on what I heard from some of the people that played the golf course, is that the intent on making this drivable for at least one of the 4 rounds. So obviously at 355, you'd have to have a downwind hole to go out there and do so, but that is the prevailing wind at this golf course. So there's a chance that this might be drivable for 1, maybe even 2 of the 4 rounds. And if you are going to lay up off the tee, it's probably an iron as opposed to a 3-wood before that you were hitting off hole number 8. So one of the few examples of a hole that they're probably making easier with some of the changes. Hole number 9 is not easier though. So hole 9, I mentioned that this one was going to be lengthened a lot. It can play 260 yards. So they added a tee box way back here below this cart path that you can see from the overhead views. And they're only going to play it to 260 if it's to a right side pin location. The people that have already played the course have told me that the right side is a lot more gradual than what you have on the left. And the left side of the green is apparently one of the more difficult green complexes that you have on property. So at least if what they said is true, if they're going to put it on the left side, any pin location, they're going to have to shorten up this hole, make it closer to like maybe 220, which, compared to 260 yards, which is how long this hole can play when it's tipped out, 220 would be a little bit more reasonable for a difficult pin location. So we'll have to see what they do. Still going to be grain stands around hole number 9. It will be a whole lot of fun. The back 9 now has some more subtle changes. So hole 10 is a hole that hasn't had that much done to it. So if we go back to hole 10, got a little ahead of myself by clicking next hole there. It's about the same length. They've moved around some bunkers, but the general idea of hole 10 didn't change much, at least based on what I heard. 11's got some different bunkering this time. It's also got a different green complex, which is going to add some difficulty, but it's about the same length that it was before, and in general has not changed very much based on what I've heard. Hole 12 has the same general sort of idea. In fact, it's actually a little bit longer this year than what it was before, but the fairway is now closer to the out of bounds fence. So over here to the right, you can see these trees. There's a little boundary fence that is out of bounds. The fairway now is a little bit closer to that fence. So I don't think you're going to see that from these overhead views, but that is the main change here in 2024. 13 has not had much that has changed other than the right side here now has a little bit more hills and hullocks to it that'll add some difficulty if you miss over here to the right. And while there's not as many trees there now, it's going to give you a hanging lie or two. So this back 9, I would say, has changed a little bit less outside of this next hole. So 14 is the big change on the back 9. It is now a par 5 as opposed to a par number 4. The tee box is moved way back. It is going to be a beefy par 5 at about 580 yards, but reachable because it does play down the hill. So it's still going to have to hit a really good tee shot, a great 3-wood, maybe driving iron into this green, but it is a scoreable look, and it is why it's now a par 71. Hole 15 is still playing over the water. From what I've heard, this green complex is even smaller now than what it was before. And what I was told with how firm the green was playing is that it would be very rare, or very unexpected, I should say, for them to play it tipped out for more than like one round. So because it's going to be so firm, hitting the ball from 200 yards over the water to a green that's concrete is going to be literally impossible, especially if there's some wind out there. So they said if it's a real calm day, maybe they do go and tip it out for these players, right? Try and make that the aspect that's difficult. But if it's windy with how firm these green complexes are likely to play, especially if they're not getting a bunch of rain this week, I would expect them to play from over at these tee boxes over here to the left, as opposed to the ones that make you just carry it over the water, which it'll still be a pretty difficult hole, right? It's an island green complex. It's a much smaller green now too, which is going to add some difficulty. But yeah, this 200-yard shot that we dream about, that it's right next to the road over here, is probably only going to be a reality for one of the few rounds. 16 might be the hole that has changed the most, at least that I like the most out here in terms of the changes. So what they've done is, you can't see it from this overhead view, but this bunker to the left of the green was completely removed. So there's no longer a bunker here, and in its place where the bunker was, it's now all grass, and they've actually dug it down even a little bit more than before, and it's about a 10-foot elevation change from the bottom of this hill up to the green, which doesn't sound all that crazy, but these players would much rather be hitting those splash shots out of a bunker as opposed to off that tight Bermuda grass, and it is going to be maybe the most difficult up and down that they see the entire year. If a pin is tucked up against that ledge to the left and you miss down there, if you're short-sighted, you've got no chance to get it within like 15 feet. Next hole, we've got hole 17. I also like what they've done here. This one was more subtle, but they made this hole a little bit shorter this year. I believe it's about 390 yards, and they took out this bunker in front of the green. So while before they would just tuck pins just over this little trench bunker, I guess they would call it, now it's a much different shaped green. It's much more, it's not really like thin. It's not like a thin oval like you see there. It's much more round here in 2024. And they took that bunker out so that there's a lot more pin locations that you can use. And based on what I heard, also a bunch of these trees, by the way, were taken out of this hole, so it's a little bit more wide open in terms of trying to drive it up there, is that they can make it drivable, especially if it's playing downwind. By the way, this hole plays the same direction as hole number 8, so if you're getting a strong downwind on those two holes, then both might be drivable out there for that given round. So if you're a big prop player, if you're somebody that's trying to handicap the golf course, that is something that you should definitely know heading into this event, is that if it plays in that direction, that the golf course is likely going to play a lot easier because of these drivable, really good birdie looks that you could have. And then finally, 18 is still a par 5, so they didn't change the finishing hole all that much, at least with like your tee shot and then your second shot, but the green is a lot different. So they've taken out these two massive bunkers and made them a little bit smaller. So I believe there's like 4 greenside bunkers now, as opposed to these 2 really big ones. So they kind of just like divvied them up a little bit. And then the green is a lot different. The green, I've heard, is a lot more complex than before. The around the green shots are supposedly going to be a lot more difficult to get up and down, in that they favor a draw shot. That's what I heard from almost everyone that told me something about hole number 18, is that it's like tailor-made for Rory's ball flight. If you can hit a high draw into the green, you're going to have a really good chance of holding it. And apparently that high fade, which has become, commonplace, one of the best shots that you can hit at most golf courses, is not so much the shot that you want around this version of East Lake. So maybe it's just hole 18 where you're going to see that the most, but that was something I heard from a multitude of people about this course, and multiple brought up Rory too, which I thought was interesting as well. Now that we've seen the course, we're going to try and do our best with the modeling here, but I imagine that after I get on site, I see this track, and it's probably going to change a lot when we get to Wednesday. So take this with a grain of salt. I'm just going to do our best to handicap this course, and let's go through the modeling out there for this week. So in terms of my modeling percentages, you can see that we still have a weighted shots gained of all the 4, quote unquote, regular shots gained categories. So I've got 20% off the tee, 25% on approach. So that's, a whole 45% right there, which if you've been following the channel, that's commonplace. I'm usually much higher on ball striking than I am with the short game. And this golf course in the past, East Lake Golf Club, has been a ball striking fest. So I don't think that's just going to change with, the renovations that they've done, right? It might play a little bit more difficult, which could bring around the green into play a little bit more than what I was looking at before. But historically, this is a ball striking fest. And even though it is going to play differently in 2024, I don't know if we want to, get away from that identity here at East Lake Golf Club. The things that I added on top of that, we've got a little bit of Bermuda grass putting, which I'll always look at when we're playing on a grainy Bermuda surface like we're going to get this week. And then you can see I added some approach distribution, a few proximity buckets out there in my analysis. So 150 to 175, and then also 175 to 200. I added a little bit of extra emphasis there. So in total, it's about 40% that we have on the shots gained approach. And then with the putting, it's about a 25% weight. So obviously the 15 on your regular shots gained putting, and then a little 10% out there on their Bermuda grass baseline. And that's how we go out there and get the model for this week. So just going to sort this by model ranking, kind of talk through some of the top plays, as we only have a 30 player field. So we can go through most of the field here rather quickly. So Xander's number 1, which is great to see for a model considering how good he's been at this golf course. In fact, he's been 30 shots better over the last 7 years around East Lake than any other player in the field. So if you're looking for somebody that is an East Lake course horse, that would typically be Xander. But it's worth noting that they've changed the course. They've changed the greens. Maybe it's not going to be as favorable to him now after some of the course changes, but we'll have to see. The model still loves him, still playing some of the best golf in the world out of anybody in the field. So, no complaints from me saying him there at number 1. Number 2 is Scotty. Not the best Bermuda grass putter, but those proximity buckets is checking both boxes. Shots gained, ball striking, gaining nearly 1.7 shots gained per round. So nothing to complain about there. So I like that those two are 1 and 2. You'd expect that. And with their starting strokes, they're going to be really tough to beat out there around East Lake. Where it gets a little bit more interesting is when we get into this like 3 through 7 range. You got Hideki with this form, which always makes sense. Hasn't had the best track record here, but has been okay at least around in East Lake. It'll be Ludwig's first time around this course, which is maybe an advantage given that they just renovated the golf course. It's worth noting that I don't have apex height on here, which by the way, guys, the reason why apex height is something I hardly use out there on tour is that apex height is a driving stat. I think a lot of people, when they think about apex height, think about the apex height of iron shots, but because they don't have TrackMans out there in the center of every fairway, that they're going up and setting up behind every player before they hit, you're not going to get an apex height for iron shots. In fact, the apex height stat over there on the PGAtour.com, these databases that'll track that, is apex height of your tee shots. This week, though, it's worth noting, it's the reason why I'm bringing it up with Aubert, and also I guess with Hideki, we'll add this on top of that, is that a really high high ball flight at a course that's playing firm and fast is favorable. So, and while it is true that most of the guys that hit the ball high off the tee also tend to hit the ball high with their irons, there are guys that hit the ball low off the tee that I know that can launch their irons high. Prime example would be a Minwoo Lee. Hits a ton of driver stingers, likes to keep the ball low off the tee and a little bit more controlled, whereas into the greens, he has one of the highest ball flights that you see on the PGA Tour. So obviously he's not in this field given how he's played this year, but guys like Ludwig that launch the ball high, Xander can hit the ball higher than just about anyone out there on the PGA Tour. A Rory has a high apex height with his irons. I know it's not something that we can look at because it's not something that the PGA Tour tracks, but just knowing the guys that have that high ball flight with their irons, I think could be helpful this week because having the ability to stop the golf ball on some concrete hard greens is going to be a factor out there. You've got Victor up there, obviously last year's champion. I'm starting a little bit far back to take for an outright, but I do think he sets up particularly well at this course even after renovation. Tony Finau's got a high ball flight. I've got to say though, the putting stats and this proximity bucket stuff isn't the most favorable out there for Tony. And Aaron Rai, not the best Bermuda grass putter, but obviously gonna ball strike this golf course to death. So with it playing firm and fast, I think that could play into Rai's favor. Tommy Fleetwood has been doing everything but putting lately. You can see there, losing 0.6 strokes putting per round. Did find something Saturday, Sunday, though, last week. So maybe he can ride that momentum into this golf tournament, and great to see that he's a top 10 model ranking. This mid-tier range includes a lot of guys that are in form, but maybe not as good players. That would include guys like an Adam Scott, Robert McIntyre that are popping off a little bit. And then you've got some of your disappointers, guys like Morikawa that have taken a little bit of a fall off lately. Rory McIlroy, of course, who had the horrendous performance over there at the Fedex St. Jude, who I don't think you're out of play at this sort of event, right? Obviously, recent form matters, but you're still talking about world-class players that might not win the FedEx Cup, but in terms of the race without starting strokes, could be live for that kind of market, and in DFS, could be valuable with the birdies that they're going after. So they've got Colin, he's $9,100 in DFS, $9,600 Rory. If we need a golf course, or need a player that is, that has a high apex height to go out there and take on a firm golf course, well, Rory has that, and he's also been really good around East Lake. And again, course history, we'll have to see how important that ends up being after all these changes, but I've heard a lot of people saying that they think that it suits up well for Rory, particularly like the drivable par fours, and then they brought up the thing about 18, and I'm like, Rory could just tear this place up. I mean, he's torn it up in the past too, so I don't think it's that far-fetched to say. They've got Wyndham in this range. Wyndham's been hitting the ball really well recently. You can see at the BMW Championship, he technically lost 3 strokes on approach, but was much, much better the last few days. And in fact, round number 1, he lost like 4 strokes approach, so outside of that, he was well into the positive. And then on Sunday, he was well into the positive with his irons before making a double bogey 7 at hole number 17. So I think that the shots gained metrics for him are a lot better than they actually look in reality, which could make him a little bit of a sleeper play. Sam Burns has been on a heater lately. He's there at number 18. Russell Henley actually ranking a little bit lower than I would expect. Ball striking stats at the BMW were a little bit worse than you probably would imagine. You can see over here his best shots gained category was around the green play last week, which does make me a little bit concerned about it. And then towards the bottom, I mean, you've got a lot of your lower tier players, a lot of your like 6-7K range guys out there in DFS, but it's worth noting that I think that accuracy could be important this week. I know before I was just looking at regular shots gained off the tee when it came to my stats, but there's a reason why I didn't add like driving accuracy or driving distance on itself. I think being long will be helpful, as it always is at a tour event, but with the fact that the fairways have gone a little bit wider, I think it's going to be easier to go out there and hit fairways, and your elite tier accuracy guys could see a huge advantage this week. With firm and fast greens, with them being extremely hard, extremely bouncy out there, hitting out of the fairway is going to be huge for controlling your spin and ultimately actually holding these green complexes. So I do think that guys like Russell Henley with that accuracy are favorable. I mean, even like a Sepp Straka, I like the accuracy there, a Billy Horschel, and Akshay Bhatia, Shane Lowry. So some of these lower tier players maybe aren't getting as big a boost as they probably should. And maybe by the end of the week, I do add driving accuracy into the equation, but a lot of these guys are also losing on approach. So I guess Shane Lowry could be in play. Zane Hoots gaining on approach out there as well. Same thing with Billy Ho. He's slightly into the positive out there, but you can see the guys that are, filtering towards the top of my modeling right now are these approach players, right? The guys that are dark green with their approach play, that are dark green with their putter, their shots gained putting on Bermuda grass, which I think is the way to handle this kind of event. It's not one where we're going to have any certainty about our modeling out there, but I think looking at some Bermuda putting, some of these proximity buckets where a majority of your shots are going to come from, and then just regular form heading into the event is the way to handle it, right? Don't overthink it when we have a new puzzle out there. When we have some changes to a golf course, just try and simplify things a little bit, make your life a little bit easier, and don't be looking at 1,000 different stats. If you think that you have this place figured out, then, tip of the cap to you, right? I certainly don't. Out here on a Monday, then treat it like that, right? Go out there, just make it a little bit bland. Don't go out there and add in, 10, 15 stats like you do for other tour events, and just play the best plays would be my advice. That is all I've got for this week's course breakdown. Hopefully you feel a little bit more prepared for all of your research and exposure and are ready to get after it for the Super Bowl of our season. I'll have that boots on the ground info, even more information for you guys about East Lake Golf Club as the week goes on. So first off, make sure you are subscribed to the channel if you haven't already so you don't miss any of that content when it goes live. That'll include our Wednesday live stream at 7 p.m. Eastern time where you can hit me up with any of the questions that you've got. And of course, go out there and smash the like button if you haven't already as well. That way we can get this content out there to even more people and help grow the channel and community as a process. I would appreciate that. I appreciate your support here on the channel as per usual, everyone. Best of luck with all of the exposure that you're getting to, and for a chance to earn a free month on my Patreon page, give me your take on what the winning score is going to be. If you go out there, get that exact number, you will win a free month of that Patreon, which of course is where I'm posting all of my projections, my modeling, all the extra content that I'm doing out there for golf events is posted there first for my Patreons, which of course are helping support the channel and what we're doing with all this content and some of the on-course visits like we're doing over here at East Lake, right? The best time to be on the Patreon is when you're getting all this extra info behind the paywall, which I'll share some over here on the live streams, the free content, but for everything behind the scenes over there at East Lake, make sure to check out the Patreon. It's again a great resource. Link is in the description of the video, and for a chance to earn that free month of the Patreon page, just go ahead, give me your winning score for the Tour Championship. Once the score is taken once, just add a caveat, it cannot be taken again. So early bird gets the worm. Go down there, claim your score if you haven't already, and let's go out there and have ourselves a week. That's all I've got, as I said before. Appreciate the support here. Best of luck out there, and let's have ourselves a week.